Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for what I hope will be a lively discussion on the insurrection in Mozambique's Cabo Delgado province. I'm Elissa Jobson, Director of Global Advocacy with International Crisis Group, and I'm going to be moderating the event today. Before I introduce the speakers, I want to thank the Mail and Guardian who are partnering with Crisis Group on this event. It's the first event that we are hosting in association, and we hope it will be the first of many. I'm delighted today to be joined by three great panelists. Dino Mahtani is Crisis Group's Deputy Africa Programme Director and the author of our recent report, Stemming the Insurrection in Mozambique's Cabo Delgado. Luis Nhachote is an investigative journalist and executive coordinator of the Centro de Jornalismo Investigativo, a non-profit organization focusing on investigative journalism in Mozambique. He is also a contributor to Mail and Guardian, the Wall Street Journal, Al Jazeera, and Forbes Africa. We're also joined today by Zenaida Machado, Senior Researcher at the Africa Division of Human Rights Watch. Since 2017, militant attacks and security force operations have claimed the lives of almost 3,000 people and displaced hundreds of thousands more in Mozambique's Cabo Delgado province. Today, our panelists are going to explore the humanitarian costs of the insurrection, its links to East African and global jihadist networks, as well as some of the economic governance issues that have sparked the crisis. We'll start with a discussion between myself and our panelists before opening up to questions for our audience. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so by using the Q&A box on the bottom right of your screen. When entering your question, please make sure that you state your name and affiliation. I'd just like to let everyone know that the meeting is being recorded and live streamed. So I'm gonna start with a couple of questions for our guest, Zenaida from Human Rights Watch. Zenaida, the conflict in Cabo Delgado has had terrible consequences for its inhabitants. Can you describe the humanitarian situation in the province and how this affects human rights?
Elissa, thank you so much for that question, and thank you once again to ICG and the Mail and Guardian for inviting me to this conversation and giving Human Rights Watch an opportunity to talk about what we have been seeing and documenting in Cabo Delgado. Just for a brief note of information, we have started working actively on Mozambique since 2015, and in 2018 we turned our focus to Cabo Delgado given the military activities there. We were initially concerned about reports of restrictions on freedom of religion, because following the attack on Mocimboa da Praia in October 2017, we started receiving reports of some places of worship being shut down, religious leaders, Muslim religious leaders being arrested. And that meant to us that things were worse than the authorities wanted to make it look like. They used to call it just actions of bandits. Those were the first signs that it was more than that. We didn't know that the situation could grow and become worse before it gets any better. But I must confess that after 3 years, it has come to a point that is far worse than anything we had imagined then. We are talking about almost 800,000 people displaced, over 1 million people killed, many of them beheaded. Pemba, the capital of Cabo Delgado, is now accommodating a double of people that it used to be back in 2017. We're talking about several IDP camps across Nampula, Niassa, and Cabo Delgado provinces. We are beginning to get reports of IDPs reaching as far as southern sides of Inhambane and so on. Thousands of people are unaccounted for. several areas in at least 3 districts, I'm talking about Mocímboa da Praia, Palma, and Macomia, are completely inaccessible. And what we know about those areas is what the IDPs are telling us, what some of our security sources are also telling us. And of course, whenever it's possible, we make use of the satellite imagery to get an idea of the damage caused by those attacks from both sides, the insurgents and the government forces. And what we are hearing and seeing is not good. Going back to your question, we have documented so far several human rights abuses, including war crimes. And that includes, for example, the killing of defenseless civilians. We have documented massive destructions of property, including schools and hospitals. We have documented houses being burned down with people inside, not having an opportunity to leave their houses. Palma, which was the most recent place to witness a big attack, and the government was claimed to have regained control early in April. It's still a very dangerous area with reports of fire almost every week. Probably fire caused by the members of this group that we call, of the insurgents, in this case that we call Al-Shabaab. And throughout this crisis, we know of a number of people that have been beheaded, including children, women who have been kidnapped for slavery and sexual abuse. We have also concerns from actions of the Mozambican security forces, and those include attacks on journalists, and we presume that that is an effort to have a single narrative of events coming from the province, arbitrary arrests, summary executions, intimidation of activists, allegations of indiscriminate bombings. It's needless to say at this stage that the bad actions of the government soldiers have repercussions on the trust and respect of affected communities, on the people's resentment. We have come across several people that have said and repeated that maybe if they were from a different religion or a different tribe, things would be much better. But we also then have to remind the security force that unlike the insurgents that seem to have a clear mission that is to kill and destroy, security forces' mission is to protect. And of course, both sides have obligations according to national laws, and the protection of civilians is indeed at the top of those obligations.
Thanks, Zenaida. I mean, that's a really bleak picture that you've portrayed there, and you know, laying out abuses and misdeeds by both sides. I wanted to ask you, you know, what do you see more broadly as the main human rights concerns in Mozambique for the short and the long term?
It's important to divide them in short and long term, but we can't exclude some of them. And it's also very difficult to prioritize what really falls under short term and what goes to the long term. But I think there are a few things that we do have to pay attention seriously in shorter term. And that's one, the rescue and protection of civilians. During our research, we have heard of shocking testimonies of people, how people fled, for example, Macomia or Mocímboa da Praia, or even Palma, that is the most recent attack. Many had to sleep, for example, in the mangroves at the beach, waiting for boats to come rescue them. And then once the boat arrives, they had to pay for the space on that boat. And then after they've paid the space for the boat, for example, they had to fight for the space. And throughout that period, there was no presence of security forces, for example. Others had to walk for several days until they found the area of safety. And then there's a smaller group of people that, of course, took advantage of, in the case of Palma, they took advantage of the rescue and evacuation process that was set up by Total. And some of them are also still being rescued by security forces. But the reports we are getting is that even for you to get rescued by security forces, you have to bribe for the space on the plane. And one thing that it seems concerning and very recurring from the whole interviews we have with people is that it would appear that the authorities are unable to reach people in some unsafe areas and remove them from those areas. And what that means is that people have been left on their own to find safety. And that shouldn't be the case. So it's clear there is a need for a plan to rescue and protect civilians if this conflict continues. There is also the element of the conditions of the IDPs, these internal displaced people. We are currently working together in partnership with Amnesty International to document the conditions of the IDPs. How are they being treated? What kind of rights are they enjoying or not? From basic access to basic rights like food, water, accommodation, to issues that have to do with their identification, because when they fled, they didn't have time to take their IDs and the IDs of their children. Education of children, access to care for trauma, rejoining their relatives. One thing I've noticed also during the process of interviews is that some women, they can't complete a full sentence without starting crying. Means they're still overwhelmed by the whole process of trying to reach safety. I have spoken to women who cannot sleep because they're still trying to, they still remember about the moment their children were taken away from them. Or for example, because they've been separated by their children, they're still worried about where they are, where to find them. In most cases, in fact, we have seen from the numbers that 75% of the IDPs are women and children. Which meant that these women left their husbands behind. They don't know where their husbands are. They have not had any communication with them to date. But also there is a need from assurance from the government that first there is hope. And second, that the government will do everything it can do to help them to find their children that have been kidnapped, to find their relatives that were separated from them, to find those who are missing. And that reassurance we haven't seen from the side of government. Communication here is very essential, and we haven't seen a clear plan on how to communicate to people in a way that they don't feel hopeless and abandoned. And of course, the authorities need to speed up. It's a crisis. They cannot continue to hide behind the excuses of no money, no conditions. And IDPs need to know where they can get food, where they can get water, healthcare, shelter, their missing relatives, and so on. And that is a responsibility of the state. Those two, I think, in shorter term are the priority. Then there is a long term. And then there is the one that I mentioned, missing people. A lot of people have been missing. And those include those that have been kidnapped. So it's important for the government to explain and set up a plan on how it intends to reconnect people to their loved ones and relatives, and how it intends to rescue the people that have been kidnapped. Access to education for children. In some areas, children have not been to school since the start of this conflict almost 4 years ago, because their schools have been destroyed, because it's not safe for them to go to school, because their teachers were being attacked on their way to schools. So education is not there. We know from the data provided by the Ministry of Education that about 45 schools have been destroyed in a country that was already problematic in terms of providing education like Mozambique. You can only imagine what 45 schools destroyed really means in terms of the impact on education. There is also the element of resettlement of people back in their regions. Once the authorities have regained control, it's not enough for the government to be building new resettlement villages. And they are calling it definitive resettlement villages. People didn't ask for definitive resettlement villages. People want to go back to where they're coming from. So the priority is to regain control, establish safety and security, and make sure that people can go back to their lives. And then at a longer term, but also very important in the case of Mozambique, is justice and accountability for crimes and abuses that are being committed. Unfortunately, Mozambique has a sad record of impunity. And hopefully Cabo Delgado won't become a repetition of what we have seen before. where the government would choose to sign peace deals and provide blank amnesties to those that committed abuses. So hopefully this time, in the case of Cabo Delgado, these abuses are being documented, and the government will work in partnership with organizations like ours and many others that are documenting human rights abuse, and make sure that people from both sides face justice, and that they will choose to pursue those responsible for those crimes and give some justice and relief to the victims of this conflict.
Thanks, Zenaida. And as I say, you've really created a very strong picture of what life is like for the displaced people and some of the challenges that they face, and some of the obligations that the government is going to have to meet in coming months, but also in the coming years. Dino, I'd like to turn to you now and talk a little bit more about the insurgency itself. The Palma attack in March has shown that the Al-Shabaab militant group, as it is known locally, has evolved massively since its creation. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that group, and also I think it'd be really interesting to hear what the risk is that Cabo Delgado turns into a new frontier for global jihad, as that seems to be a real concern for the international community. Thanks, Dino.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that, Elissa. I mean, I think what was very surprising, at least for me as a newcomer to Mozambique, at least before we embarked on this piece of work, was to understand how far back this thing actually goes. And the media reports and what's in the public information points to 2017 as actually the starting point when the first shots were fired in the port town of Mozambique the prior. That in October 2017, that tends to be the marking point for this insurrection. Actually, the first signs of this go back to as far as 2007, 2010, and then it grows from that point onwards. And back in those days, what you really had going on were disenfranchised or frustrated local boys from communities on the coast, also in the hinterland. Now, this is primarily in the two ethnic zones of the coastal Mwani and the interior dominated by the Makwa. We don't present this as an ethnic conflict. It's really not, and I really want to underline that here. But these are the constituencies from which many of the boys eventually who've joined Al-Shabaab come from. And they've suffered from underdevelopment. They are also frustrated with the domination of the political economy by certain elites, including business moguls from the Makonde community, which is the community also of President Nyusi. And through that period, they were feeding on East African jihadi Islamist pamphlets issued by prominent radicals, including Abu Drogo, a former cleric in Kenya who was killed extrajudicially in 2012. And so they're consuming on this sort of language, and it all sort of started to stir into something of a local youth revolt, actually. By 2017, the boys had acquired weapons, and that's no real surprise because Mozambique the prior is connected to the long Swahili coast that goes all the way up to Somalia, and even the Gulf of Aden, as far up as Yemen. There are ocean-going dhows that are trafficking in all kinds of illicit goods, including weapons. So it's possible that they got some weapons smuggled in from the coast. When they also started first attacking, very small groups, groups of 10 and so forth. But very quickly, over a period of several months, they snowballed into something pretty monstrous. So that by the time we saw what happened in Palma in March this year, you had several attacking groups of hundreds, more than 100 in each attacking group, heavily armed with machine guns, tactically very smart, using rocket propelled grenades and things like this. So they've mushroomed into something pretty powerful, and in so doing, they've also swept. Zenaida has talked about this, swept hundreds of thousands of people off the land, but also pushed out the state from much of these locations. So you have huge ungoverned spaces in Cabo Delgado, which is going to be a massive problem to contend with going forward, because you've got a problem there. How do you bring security back? How do you bring the people back? How do you impose the state once again? And this is something that Islamic State will take advantage of. Now, very quickly, looking at the second part of your question was, will this create a new jihadist front? Well, with that ungoverned space, you have outsiders like Islamic State looking at this group to say, what kind of opportunity do we have to tunnel in the kind of tactical or new technologies, training, leadership, financial management, as Islamic State are doing in other parts of Africa. But they also have, they're looking at the networks that can be exploited across the Swahili coast. This is also an ungoverned space of, characterized by smuggling and trafficking that can be exploited. There's also been these odd relationships between Mozambique and also militants, but way back in the past in Eastern DRC. This is why Islamic State for a time called what's going on in Mozambique as part of Islamic State Central Africa province. But as far as our research has shown, those links have pretty much died out. So there's a massive risk. Islamic State is far from controlling this group. We've made that clear in our report, but that risk is there.
Thanks, Dino. I'd like to ask you now a little bit about the Mozambican authorities' response to the crisis so far. How would you assess that? And what support do you think they need from external partners?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer this question in 2 or 3 ways. I mean, primarily this has been a security response, but it's also been a security response with a very weak national security forces. Mozambique's national army is only 12,000 strong. Mozambique itself is the size of Pakistan. Cabo Delgado is the size of Austria. So you've got a very small national force dealing with something that's spiraling out of control. Its stockpiles, its Soviet-era stockpiles are often, in a state of disrepair. Discipline of the army has also been weak. And for this reason, partially, the government has relied on a paramilitary police unit to deal with the problem. And this police unit has received over the years a measure of better funding. It's been better taken care of by successive national governments, because actually since the 1990s peace deal in Mozambique between the authorities and the Renamo opposition group, the government has sort of been under pressure from its international partners not to spend on military spending, but on development. Anyway, this is another reason why we've got a pretty weak security force, and then they've instead privileged this paramilitary police force, which has had some degree of success, particularly when it's relied on private military contractors to step in. For example, it used Wagner Group, the group that was linked to the Kremlin. Actually, that wasn't terribly successful. Then it used Dyke Advisory Group, a South African private military company, to take the fight to the insurgents. But even then, the campaign was marked by security force abuses, reports of abuses also committed by the Dyke Advisory Group. So they were able to dent militants from time to time, but not really contain them, because at every cycle of the conflict, these guys have just rebounded with ever greater ferocity. And as Zenaida has said, inflicting even more atrocious, even more atrocities on the civilian population. Now, while that's going on, it's also important to sort of divide up this group. And I see a question in the chat which chimes with this. This group is a composite movement. It's, if we split it between its muscle and its brains, the muscle is mainly Mozambican. It's youth from Mozambique who've been drawn out of these communities, as I've explained in the last question. But there's also an element of jihadists from neighboring Tanzania who've also jumped in, fleeing security force crackdowns in that country in 2017, to plug in and take an opportunity to keep the pot stirring in Mozambique, whereas they were flushed out or stamped out in Tanzania. So that when it comes to the response of the authorities, yes, they've been trying to contain this militarily, but have they, for example, open dialogue with the Mozambican elements? And our research has shown that actually the muscle or the Mozambican elements, often drawn in by money, the promise of money, they only stay in the movement sometimes because they're being paid. There was a group of them that just a few days ago that surrendered, saying that we're tired of living like animals in the bush. So they're sort of materialist in nature. And where the big policy gap that is missing in terms of the Mozambican authorities' response to this is addressing that, addressing those local grievances, because while they may not be able to get rid of the Tanzanians or stamp out Islamic State from the Swahili Coast, Mozambique, or the Swahili Coast, or planet Earth for that matter, what they can do is something about these Mozambicans. And really that's what we're sort of leaning into in our report is for the government to develop its forms of dialogue with Mozambican militants. Luckily for Mozambique, they have about $1 billion that's lined up now in terms of donor funding, which it's due to be poured in all over the north, particularly in Cabo Delgado, and they can use that to soothe local community tensions if they're able to contain the insurrection through security means. They need to invite the population back to these areas, as Zenaida has referred to, then open up community dialogues, soothe those local tensions, and use the communities and other influencers who have connections to these militant boys who are drawn from these communities to reverse the flow of recruitment. In other words, they're being recruited in Al-Shabaab by the communities from the local, these are sons of the soil of these communities, reverse that flow of recruitment away from Al-Shabaab and back into society.
Thanks, Dino. And it's really good to get the outline of how this group has developed, what it's developed into today, and the challenges that the government has faced in addressing the insurrection. Just wanted to say, it's good, we've got some questions coming in. Can everyone who wants to ask a question, please give us their name as well as their affiliation? That would be great. I want to turn to Luis now, and I'd like to sort of speak with you, Luis, a bit more about some of the causes that have led to this insurrection. I mean, you've recently been in Cabo Delgado, where you've been investigating particular economic governance problems. I wonder if you could tell us about some of the issues that you found during your research.
Thank you, Elissa. Thank you, hi to all the panelists and the participants. Cabo Delgado reporting project is a part of the Center for Investigative Journalism since we launched our website 3 years ago, and we are doing Cabo Delgado because part of our staff is based in them, and we are also training local journalists. That's why we are still covering this. The political and geographic situation is going more worse. As Zenaida said, I've been in Pemba, and also I went to Montepuez and the Chiuri district, but Pemba, the picture of Pemba is not good. It's not good because I think it's more than double people who fled for this war are in Pemba. And what we see in Pemba is it's like a conflict between the state authorities with NGOs, because government is not allowed the NGOs to give them support to the internally displaced people without pass through the National Calamity and Disaster Institute. This is not good for those all NDPs, because they're taking days to have the first aid assistance on the ground until the authorization, legal, official state authorization for those support from NGOs from these populations. I've been in Paquitique, the most well-known, poorest neighborhoods in Pemba City, where I found people who arrived who fled from Palma to Pemba at an artisanal vessel who takes sometimes more than a week to arrive in Pemba without any goods. And when they arrive in Pemba, they first must be registered by the states. But what they need is completely very urgent on the ground. But those support, those aids must be authorized by government to give to those populations. So, and other things where you find that will begin now the new conflicts between the Mozambicans. It's regarding the lands. Most of the people fled to the streets under the attacks are looking for the safe place for start the new life, and they now facing the problems with local people in some districts, such Montepuez, who the natives want money to give them space to set up something to them to live, etc. So basically, we are still doing a research to try to understand more about the local Mozambicans inside this insurgency, how they affiliated, how they recruited. So this is a part of a long-term research we are doing, because last year our highlights was about the two local Mozambicans who are leading these insurgents. They are people from Mocimboa da Praia, who are they recruiting young people, or sometimes abducted and kidnapping them and take them by force to join these insurgents. So we are trying to understand how it works, how the local communities also, which are under suspicion to report about military presence to these jihadism groups.
Thanks, Louis. And I just wonder if you could perhaps expand a little bit more about, how, because you said you're looking into this, but what have you found out about how these issues have contributed to the rise of the group known as Al-Shabaab?
In the Cabo Delgado, in some districts, is a part of Mozambique. Is a big country. They are not presence of the states, and what those people, these insurgents, are doing since this beginning is most to spread fear. They are not to occupy the places for a long time. After they burning houses, killing people, and force people to flow, they are also going back to the bushes. But what we are looking, what we understand is about the presence of states becomes when these gas projects was announced and started exploration, and those who were using certain corridors in Cabo Delgado, such as Mocimboa da Praia, we understand that the drug trafficking is another thing linking for those people to spread this fear, spread this word, because from the past, Cabo Delgado was a big corridor of drugs. Now we are seeing these movements going down now to Nampula, and Nampula, the coast of Nampula, the littoral of Nampula, and they will continue to do that to continue and have the roads, access of the roads of the drug trafficking. A few weeks ago, we had on headlines, one of the most important businessmen of Cabo Delgado was caught with drugs. Yeah.
Thanks, Luis. I'm going to turn now to some of the questions that we've got from the audience. We've got a couple of questions here, I think, relating specifically to the groups the armed groups that are operating in Cabo Delgado. Lois Ndegwa asks, what are the sources of funding for the group and how much influence do regional jihadists have in the group? I mean, I think Dino has sort of touched on that last one to a certain extent. Lois also asks about how much support the local groups, how much support the groups have from local communities. Dino, could I put those questions to you?
Yeah, I'll start with the question of local support. I mean, the relationship it's a complicated relationship. I've referred to it also as an abusive relationship between civilians and the militants, because on one hand, civilians are being killed, decapitated, murdered, sometimes, you know, in what seem to be pretty indiscriminate fashion. Although when you look a bit closer, in certain cases, you'll find that the militants have been killing for very specific reasons. And one example that we had from our research, from speaking directly to eyewitnesses in the camps in the south of the province, was that some civilians saw in Mocimboa da Praia in August 2020, militants checking the identification of civilians and making a judgment call in their minds as to who was connected to the state, and killing those people, but then allowing those who seem to be dispossessed of any state identification or seeming to be sort of somewhat a bit poorer or marginalized, letting them pass. And also killing in Mocimboa da Praia those who seem to have names, you know, Christian names or Makonde ethnic names. So this is what we heard from an eyewitness. So on the one hand, you know, it's an abusive relationship, but there are degrees of abuse. Let's also not forget that from these communities are also the boys themselves. They've been recruited from these communities. There are other civilians, for example, who told us, and I think Zenaida has a lot of information on this as well, but we've heard similar stories that when, for example, militants came across civilians on the coast, south of Mocimboa da Praia in a particular attack, they killed some civilians. Others then identified those that they had local connections to. Perhaps they were members of the same community who'd been recruited, and they actually gave safe passage to a number of people to flee. So they spared the lives of some of these people. So it's a mixed bag. This is a predatory armed group that's not actually governing territory. It's roaming around. It's basing itself in remote camps and then roaming through territory that it's flushed the population and the state largely off the land. And then when it encounters civilians, if it feels that those civilians are somehow collaborators or people who constitute a threat, then it's death. If those civilians tend to be recognized by some of the militants, then there'll be some mercy that is applied. And you know, that's also an important tactic, because there's still a lot of recruitment coming out of some of these local communities, which brings me onto the question of money, because money is playing an important role. So we've heard lots of stories of money being put in the hands of young men to come and join this group to begin with. There are also media reports of men who've been involved for Al-Shabaab in combat, who themselves have been given bonuses, particularly after they've been wounded in combat, for example. So they're given financial incentives. What we do know, and I heard this, I mean, maybe Luis also knows a little bit about this, but from around the mid-2010s, 2015, there was money coming from abroad being pumped into the banking system in Mocimboa da Praia. So there's some money coming from outside. It's not very clear where this might be. You know, in terms of how they are gathering local revenues, well, I suspect, but I don't have particularly strong evidence that, you know, there are forms of taxation, you know, billeting from the communities themselves. In other words, just taking what they need from from the communities. But also, as Lewis said, even though the drugs trade has traditionally been the private hunting ground of elites that are connected often to to the ruling elites of the country and the ruling powers in Cabo Delgado. There are now, I mean, there's some NGOs who've looked into this and say there's no connection, and we shouldn't make a distinction or make a connection between terrorists and narco traffickers. But there is a small intersection that's possibly developing. We get this information from sources, including those who are monitoring the communications of militants themselves, that obviously if they've taken control of the beachheads now on the coast of Cabo Delgado, they're also perhaps taking control of some of the drug landings. But as Lewis says, most of it has been pushed south towards Nacala, and possibly also much of it into Tanzania. But there's a small amount that's coming through still into Cabo Delgado that's possibly also falling into the hands of militants. And after all, they control now, or they are a big part of managing the road networks, who gets access to the road networks through which these drugs are trafficked. There's some similarities actually to the way things are unfolding, for example, in the Sahel in West Africa in that regard.
Thanks, Dino. I mean, we've had a few questions come through around the effectiveness and efficiency of the government. In particular, we've got some questions here from, sorry, I'm just having a bit of difficulty with my screen. Give me one moment, apologies for this. We got a question from Maureen Lempke, who wants to know about logging and mining concessions operating in the province, and if there's any indication of intersection between illicit logging and funding the insurrection. Yeah, I mean, if you could answer that one, Lewis, I think that would be interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, the only company who pays revenue, who gives revenue for the states in Cabo Delgado is Montepuez Ruby Mining. It's the biggest mining company in the province, in the country also. It's one of the biggest contributors for our economy. But a part of that, we still have another company such Fura, then another from Australia, I don't remember yet now the names, who state authorities are still complaining for they not paying. But illegal mining, it's another big activities, I think, who's feeding this insurgency. For example, in the Nhachote district, there is a village I went called Namalia. We find out a new road who have been built by the diggers of 32 kilometers of the roads. Most of the people there are using motorbikes, and the rubies you can buy it's illegal at the black markets, at the prey, at the square, like in Montepuez. Montepuez Ruby Mining has their big own structure of security, but on the black market, you still have a lot of people looking for rubies from all parts of the world, Nigerians, Pakistanians, etc. And so this is continuing, and without any control of the state.
Thanks, Lewis. I'd like now to turn to Kelly Moss's question. She's from CSIS, and this one I think is for Zenaida. She wants to know, she wants someone to speak about the reports of forced repatriation of Mozambican refugees in neighboring countries such as Tanzania. Zenaida, do you have any thoughts on that?
Thank you for that. I think it's important to note the links and similarities between people from southern Tanzania and northern Mozambique. So the movements of people have always been there. The recent reports come in a new scenario of the huge presence of the UNHCR in the area, and therefore alarms can be raised, and the massive numbers of people that are being sent back. But people fleeing to Tanzania because of this military conflict has been happening since the beginning. Because for many of them, it's first easier to go that side. Secondly, because they would feel more comfortable go to Tanzania than going to other places of Mozambique, including going to Pemba, for example. The other element is that if you look at at access via land and consider the dangers that will be imposed to them on their way to Pemba, is actually much easier for them to just walk to Tanzania. So the reports are, the people going to Tanzania is not new. What we are yet to establish at this moment is how many people have indeed crossed to that side. Where are they? I have, for example, in the process of interviewing people, spoken to victims or people who have lost their relatives or had, for example, children kidnapped who are already based in Tanzania for about 2 years or 1 year. What again, as I was saying, what we are missing is how many people have gone to Tanzania and how many people have Tanzania sent back. And that's what we don't have. And I don't think the UNHCR also has that number, which is sad. Because neither UNHCR or Tanzania or Mozambique have an effective idea of how many people have crossed to Tanzania. Where are they? What are they doing? We have heard reports, for example, of cases where Tanzania is actually no longer repatriating people through the Cabo Delgado border. They collect the people and drive them, for example, to the side of Niassa and drop them there because it's apparently safe. Niassa is safe. So it could be the situation where they think that if it's Cabo Delgado that is not safe, but there are other places in Mozambique that is safe. There's also reports from the side of Tanzania that the reason why they cannot provide the status of refugees to these Mozambicans is because Mozambique itself has not clarified what is going on in its territory. And that again is what I would bring again an answer to a question I saw about the involvement of SADC. I think the reason why there is a delayed response from SADC to the Mozambican case is because they are too focused on the military intervention. And they cannot see outside the box and the bigger picture. There are so many things that SADC should have done by now that didn't do because it's focused on the idea of sending an armed group there to fight. For example, the issue of refugees, it was known from the beginning, if there's something going on wrong in Mozambique, it will spill over to the regions. It might not be in the same status, but it will be, for example, in the current setting, people fleeing and having to go to where is safe. They can go to Tanzania, they can go to Malawi, tomorrow they will go to Zimbabwe. We have seen the similar things, for example, with the Gorongosa conflict where people would flee to Zimbabwe. So it seems that SADC has also missed that point. We have had, for example, callings from the UN for Tanzania to receive the refugees. And again, I want to reiterate those calls. Tanzania has obligations and it has to receive those Mozambicans who are fleeing conflict. But we haven't heard that call, for example, from SADC, which is the closest regional body and probably the one whose voice will be heard quickly. We assume that. We also, for example, haven't heard much from SADC on issues of humanitarian help to people that are fleeing those areas of violence. We haven't seen from SADC a robust plan on how it intends to assist Mozambique in dealing with such an avalanche of IDPs. and in preparing Mozambique and local authorities to receive this group of people and ensure that their basic rights, the ones I mentioned earlier, are respected. We haven't seen, for example, from SADC, a clear plan on how to ensure that this group can no longer recruit, because it's also important to understand why is it that a group that was considered a small group of bandits at the beginning of this conflict is now seen as a group that has pledged alliance to IS and is able to recruit among the Mozambican youth. What is going on in those areas that young people can easily be convinced to go grab a gun, grab a machete, and go kill their own neighbors and relatives? So those are issues that SADC should start looking at. Mozambique as an example, and avoid that similar situations are repeated in other countries in the region, because the Mozambican problems are not very different from what we see across the region.
Thanks, Zenaida, on that. I mean, I'd like to ask Dino a sort of follow-up question on the SADC. We've had quite a few questions coming through, including one from Matthias Hindar, who's an analyst at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and Cobus Marius, a South African member of Parliament. Why do you think that well, one, what do you think that SADC can do? Where should it be intervening? And also, why has President Nyusi been so reluctant to accept foreign interventions so far?
Okay, I'm going to answer that in reverse order, Elissa. So there are two main pillars of understanding, you know, and the truth somewhere in between, or the truth is actually represented by both pillars to some extent. Now, the critics of the government point out that Cabo Delgado is a repository of all kinds of illicit trafficking, including drugs trafficking that we've talked about, and that's all connected mainly to historically to ruling elites. So by having an external military deployment being dumped into that environment, you are going to change the nature of what is essentially a smuggling economy, or already in some ways is a war economy in some ways already. So that their senior people in connected to the ruling elites or within the ruling party, very nervous of upsetting that balance. On the other hand, the government say that's not, they dismiss that. They say, actually, what we're worried about is having, and there was a plan a few weeks ago to have no less than 3,000 troops dumped or gathered and placed into Cabo Delgado, pulled together from SADC member states to operate in this environment. And the Mozambicans are saying, well, that's, where has this ever really worked? And to point, to some degree, they have a point. Because if you look at what's happened with SADC member states who've cobbled together what is the Force Intervention Brigade and have deployed into Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo under UN blue helmets, they failed there for several years. And I've worked in that environment. I've even advised the FIB on how to conduct their operations there. They failed to get their arms around the Allied Democratic Forces, which is another armed group, one faction of which is purportedly also tied to Islamic State. And that has been going on for several years. And it's very difficult for those troops to come in and to really understand the conflict environment in which they're working, because that armed group there is tied into all kinds of elite politics. And so, what may appear to be an armed group or a non-state armed group has government interests within that. Similarly, in Mozambique, and this is not something that we've been able to prove, but these are sort of pretty astonishing anecdotes when you think about it. We've talked to people, for example, who have relinquished or fled Mocimboa da Praia, for example, down south to the provincial capital Pemba. And they've left behind their economic assets, so their properties, but also these are business elites we're talking about, some of their mining concessions, some of their forestry concessions, they've had to just walk away from. Now, all of a sudden, in Pemba, they start getting approached by government brokers bringing in other buyers who are offering to purchase those properties off them. In other words, this conflict has become a catalyst for some kind of transactions that are taking place at an elite business level. And there are, for example, you know, if you just look at the set of interests, Mocimboa de Praia port was stormed by the militants in 2020 August, and the state was vacated, the population fled. That is the port from which that, you know, there would be big developments taking place to support the gas industry in Palma. Who does that benefit? Well, that benefits certain elites in other port cities, including Pemba. So there's competition there, and there's suspicion that there may even be, I mean, this is a Mozambican affair, there may even be links between people who are not part of an Islamic insurgency per se, but who are business people who have an incentive to see this conflict continuing in a certain direction. So that also explains why the government may be hesitant, but it also leads us to the conclusion that if anything, there has to be a political solution here, because if you just put in troops that aren't familiar with the territory, that aren't necessarily responsible to a Mozambican chain of command, things could get very, very, very messy. And right now, what seems to be happening, which may be, I mean, it's not the best solution, because this conflict has dragged on for months, you know, for years, and there've been a lot of people killed. But there is finally some small progress being made with Mozambican special forces troops being trained by international partners. We're starting to get a grip on some of the road networks in the province. And, you know, well, there have been some news reports that there have been some landmines being used. I sincerely hope that that isn't the case. But if these special forces can have some impact, that might be a better solution than putting in a huge external deployment, which will just be an advertisement for international jihadists to come and attack. So to round off that question, which then sort of relates to the final policy here, is that even Mozambican officials know, and they've said to us, that they are aware that they will never defeat or exterminate this group. They can't just wipe them out. It's never going to happen. They're part of the fabric. They came from the fabric of Cabo Delgado society. Better to use whatever military pressure can be used to stand up Mozambican forces to deal with their own problems and contain and degrade this group, to give the fighters enough of an incentive to start rethinking why they should be sitting in the bush suffering under that military pressure. But by the same token, also offer, with the other hand of the state, incentives, including these economic incentives that can be used to facilitate and trigger some kind of dialogue, first with communities and then with militants themselves.
Thanks, Dino. I'm afraid that that's all we've got time for today. I hope you agree that we had there was a rich and interesting discussion and presentations from all of the panelists. And I'm sorry that we didn't get to have time to address all the questions. You know, we did have a lot of questions coming through on the Q&A. Before we finish, I'd like to thank our three panelists, Zenaida, Luis, and Dino, and the Mail and Guardian for partnering with Crisis Group on this event. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and I hope you'll be able to join us again next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.